As Bob Dutko, evangelical radio talk show host and Christian apologist, continues to try and build his case that the Bible can be relied upon as true, he references what he considers to be fulfilled prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures regarding Gentiles and Jews in their relation to Jesus.
It's also prophesied in Isaiah 9 as well as Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 65 that the Gentiles will seek the Messiah, which of course we do read as well in the New Testament, the Gentiles seeking the Messiah, Romans 11:25, Matthew 4:16. It's prophesied that he would be rejected by the Jews, by his own people. This is prophesied in Isaiah 8:14 and Psalm 118:22. And sure enough, Jesus was rejected by his own people, the Jews.
The New Testament proof texts Dutko refers to support his claim that Gentiles would seek out the Messiah don't really support the assertion he's trying to make. Romans 11:25 does not claim Gentiles will seek out the Messiah, only that a set number of them will convert to Christianity, and it does so in the context of the redemption of all of Israel, not that Jews would reject Jesus outright. The so-called Jewish rejection of Jesus, as Dutko puts it, was a temporary condition. As Paul writes, "I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and in this way, all Israel will be saved." In fact, Paul earlier in the chapter writes, "Did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people." In Paul's theology, expressed in Romans 11, the hardening of Israel toward Jesus as Christ is temporary, staving off the end of the world, so that Gentiles could share in God's redemption. As for the reference to Matthew 4:16 as somehow fulfilling the prophecy that Gentiles would seek out the Messiah, all we read is, "The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." This is actually a quote the author of Matthew takes from Isaiah chapter 9, but it makes no mention of Gentiles seeking out the Messiah. In fact, this passage has been dealt with already in episode 25 in its own context. Ironically, for the apologist trying to argue for prophecy fulfillment, Jesus was supposedly filling out each of the required prophecies to be considered the Jewish Messiah, and yet the very reason the Jews rejected Jesus was because they felt he was not fulfilling the expected role. Those most well-versed in their own scriptures rejected this claimant, while those least familiar with the Hebrew texts, the Gentiles, were the ones to buy into the Christian message. And apparently, Roman Gentiles weren't a particularly discriminating bunch when it came to accepting new religions. The first century CE Roman historian Tacitus remarked regarding Christianity that it was a pernicious superstition which escaped Judea, the home of the disease, and made its way into Rome itself, where all things horrible and shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. Even the Apostle Paul himself writes that those who are accepting his message are not very bright by the measure of human intelligence. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. While the Jewish leadership is said in the Gospels to have plotted against Jesus and held trial for him, it was the Gentile Romans who ultimately put him to death. It's no more accurate to say the Jews rejected Jesus simply because they all didn't convert, or that it was the Jewish leadership who rejected him, than it is to say Gentiles sought him out as the Messiah when the vast majority remained pagan and the new religion was considered illegal by the Gentile government of Rome for centuries. In fact, the Gospels report Jesus being followed by throngs of Jewish locals and country people wherever he went. The sick flocked to him, and he held sermons for multitudes of Jewish people. The only reason the authorities didn't descend to arrest him was out of fear of the Jewish people who adored Jesus, according to the Gospels. Jewish crowds greeted and hailed him as the Messiah when he rode into Jerusalem, according to the stories. Only by the manipulation of the Jewish authorities do the evangelists tell us that the people turned on Jesus. Mention of Gentiles seeking out Jesus and converting to Christianity are few and far between in the Gospels, and frankly, don't likely reflect historical reality. So this portrait of Jewish rejection is a bit exaggerated. Of course, over time, Christianity grew into a separate religion apart from Judaism, but just as it spread among non-Jewish people, so too Jewish people converted to Christianity, while at the same time both Jewish and pagan religions remained populated. But the fact remains that Christianity did break off from Judaism and found a much more favorable reception from Gentiles than it did from Jews. But considering the prophecies which Dutko references, were they really saying what he claims they said? Were they predicting the Messiah would be rejected by Jews but sought out by Gentiles? As for Gentiles seeking out the Messiah, Dutko mentions 3 chapters from the book of Isaiah, which apparently record these predictions: Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, and Isaiah 65. Again, Isaiah 9 is what is referenced in Matthew 4:16 as people living in darkness and having seen a great light. This verse is dealt with again in episode 25. As for Isaiah 11, it is likely the Apologist is referring to Isaiah 11 verse 10, which reads, "In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious." Once again, another episode in this series, episode 19, deals with this chapter of Isaiah in its original context, but it may be worth noting biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann's comment on this verse. It is evident that this entire unit of verse 1 through 10 concerns a king at the edge of the horizon of the 8th century. The prophetic tradition stayed close to its own time, place, and circumstance. The poem is not a prediction of Jesus, nor even an anticipation of one so remote. Considering Isaiah 65, it is likely Dutko had in mind verse 1 from that chapter. "I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. To a nation that did not call on my name, I said, Here am I, here am I." To put this verse into context, we need to step back to chapter 64 of Isaiah, where we find the Israelites calling out to their God, "You have hidden your face from us, and have given us over to our sins." And, "After all this, Lord, will you hold yourself back? Will you keep silent and punish us beyond measure?" Now, beginning at verse 1 of chapter 65, Yahweh responds to the previous chapter's questions and complaints. It is in this context one must understand Isaiah 65:1, not as a prophecy regarding a future Messiah, but as a reply by Yahweh to Israel's complaints. As Old Testament scholar H.P. Leopold, in his exposition of Isaiah, notes regarding this verse, it should be borne in mind that this chapter shows how God is minded toward his people and their prayers. God was willing enough to make himself available. The first approach did not begin with Israel. They were a people who did not seek him out. He was hoping that he might be found by them, but they were not behaving as God has a right to expect that they would. So the point made by the verse is, Israel was calling upon the Lord. That action seemed good, but it was disappointing because there was no outreach on the nation's part to the Lord. It is obvious we regard verse 1 as describing Israel's attitude toward God, just as verse 2 clearly refers to Israel. Isaiah is making it clear why even Israel's prayers had to be rejected. Strangely, Paul quotes these first 2 verses, applying verse 1 to the Gentiles and verse 2 to Israel. According to the text and context, Paul does not abide by the letter of the passage. We must keep in mind that this section of Isaiah was addressing those who had returned from exile. Having returned, they were not behaving as they should, according to the prophet. So, contrary to the Apologist's assertions, both ancient and modern, Isaiah 65 was not in reference to Gentiles seeking out the Messiah, but about Israel itself. As for Jewish rejection of Jesus as the Messiah, in previous episodes we've had opportunity to discuss many Isaiah passages as they should be understood in their original contexts, and not the context foisted upon them by the early Christian evangelists and modern apologists. In every case thus far, we've learned the Christian application of their proof texts do disservice to the original Hebrew Bible. Dutko's reference to Isaiah 8:14 as a prophecy regarding Jewish rejection of Jesus as the Christ is no exception. As already noted in episode 21 regarding the context for these early chapters of Isaiah, most scholars agree that this section of Isaiah was written in reference to current events, namely, when Judah was under threat from a coalition of forces from Damascus in Syria under leadership of King Rezin, and Samaria in Israel, the northern kingdom called Ephraim in Isaiah, led by King Pekah. This northern coalition was pressuring the southern state of Judah to join up with them against the Assyrians, who were threatening from the north. The king of Judah, Ahaz, did not want any part of this alliance, and so the coalition was threatening attack. Fearing his total annihilation, Ahaz turned to Assyria itself for help. In chapter 8 of Isaiah, we read Isaiah's response to those in Israel who were seeking a political solution to their troubles instead of relying solely on Yahweh for guidance and assistance. Angry, Yahweh says through the prophet that instead of salvation, he will use the Assyrians to crush the people. Because this people has rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloh and rejoices over Rezin and the son of Ramallah, therefore the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty flood waters of the Euphrates, the king of Assyria with all his pomp. As a warning to those who would seek outside the protection of Yahweh, the Hebrew God is recorded as saying, "The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. He will be a holy place. For both Israel and Judah he will be a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble. They will fall and be broken. They will be snared and captured." Now the Apologist wants to suggest that these last verses are in fact a prophecy about Jews rejecting Jesus as the Messiah in the 1st century CE, but it's plain from the context in which they are found, nothing could be further from the truth. As Brevard Childs, Sterling Professor of Divinity and Fellow of Davenport College, Divinity School of Yale University, has noted regarding this passage, the true issue at stake is between two visions of reality. Does the future lie in the throes of power politics and clever human machinations, which evoke fear and uncertainty? Or does the future lie with God, the Holy One of Israel, who is the real power to be reckoned with? And noted biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann observes regarding the proper context of these verses, the people, especially the king, are preoccupied with the Israel-Syria conspiracy, but they have it all wrong. It is not Israel and Syria that must be feared, for their days are numbered. For the prophet, it is Yahweh who requires all attention, no one else. Yahweh is the one causing trouble for Judah, and the king misconstrues everything because the king does not acknowledge Yahweh to be so crucial. In verses 14 and 15, it is evident that the prophet takes up the old reassuring theology of Zion, the one sung about in the Psalms, and turns it against Zion. H.C. Leopold, the late professor of Old Testament theology at Evangelical Lutheran Theological Seminary at Capital University, Columbus, Ohio, noted regarding these verses, "A sinful nation should also be aware of the fact that if Yahweh be not sought as refuge, he will become for the sinners a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling, and that shall be an issue with which both houses of Israel shall have to reckon. But as for the inhabitants of Jerusalem themselves are concerned, he shall be a trap and a snare." The Old Testament already clearly reveals that aspect of the truth which shows the Lord to be the one who was set for the fall and rising of many in Israel. Such a time of decision seemed to be upon Jerusalem and Israel in a special sense at this particular season. Obviously, then, when these passages are understood in their original historical context, they cannot possibly be referring to a Jewish rejection of Jesus centuries in the future. Otto Kaiser, in his commentary on Isaiah 8, places the entire passage into proper historical perspective. This prophecy is in truth a retrospective judgment on the causes of the decline of the two houses of Israel, the northern kingdom, which ceased to exist in 722, and the southern kingdom, which had followed its brother state in 587. According to the judgment made in agreement with the prophetic tradition, the depths of which are attained only in 31:3, both have failed in the fear of Yahweh through what in the end has proved to be their disastrous foreign policy, and with their fear of men have thus put his Godhead itself in question. What the author of the memorial ultimately impresses on his contemporaries is that Israel as a whole has been brought low by its God, and not by the world powers, whom he merely used as his instrument. The God who could have been Israel's rock of refuge in all dangers has become, in what is probably a linguistic innovation, the equivalent of a stone of offense, or a stumbling block to a blind man or a nocturnal traveler. And as the poet puts it, perhaps alluding to the siege of Jerusalem laid first by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians, he has become a snare and a trap, which has seized the inhabitants of the city. And finally, Stuart A. Irvine, Associate Professor and former Director of the Religious Studies Program at Louisiana State University, concludes, The passage thus articulates the same message that Isaiah delivered on other occasions during the same period. If the house of David honors Yahweh's sovereignty and follows his instructions, holding out against the demands of the coalition, as well as those of many Judeans, Yahweh will defend Zion, his holy domain, and its ruler Ahaz. Verse 15 pronounces the disaster that will befall the Israelites and many Judeans. Many of them will stumble and fall, and be shattered, and be snared and trapped. Again, from the context of these verses, it is clear that the Jewish people who were to stumble were those turning away from Yahweh during the Syrian-Ephraim crisis in the 8th century BCE, and that Isaiah 8 had absolutely nothing to do with Jewish rejection of Jesus as the Messiah centuries later. This is just a gross misreading of Isaiah for the purposes of propping up the Christian message. As for the reference to Psalm 118, it should come as no surprise that this too has been taken out of context in order for Christians to apply it to Jesus. As we learned in episode 29, using the Psalms as prophecy was already a well-established practice in various Jewish sects at the time the texts of the New Testament were being written, and that practice extended to the evangelists of the new Christian movement. When the author of Luke placed usage of this psalm as applying to Jesus upon the lips of Jesus himself in chapter 20 of his book, for example, he was merely following in this practice. But of course, that does not make identification of the psalm with Jesus true, or is it evidence that the psalm was indeed a prophecy at all. The passage from Psalm reads, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The Lord has done it this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad." When read in its proper non-prophetic context, we learn that Psalm 118 is actually merely a song of thanksgiving. As biblical scholar Hans Krauss notes in his commentary on the psalm, from verse 19 we learn that the singer who is presenting the thanksgiving is in a festival procession that is on its way to the portal of Yahweh. Psalm 118 therefore belongs to the area of gate liturgies. At entry to the temple area, each cultic participant is to give a declaration of loyalty. At festival time, the throng of praising and thanking participants entered the gates in a procession and were welcomed at the entrance by a liturgy of antiphonal statements and songs. Therefore, we must understand the psalm in this context. The psalm singer has been saved from particular distresses, including the threat of death from which he has been rescued, and is now presenting his thanksgiving in the liturgy as he approaches the gate. When we come to verse 22 of the psalm, we now encounter the response given by those greeting those coming through the entry. Again, as Krauss explains, voices of the festival assembly are heard. A group expresses amazement at the rescue of the person threatened by death. These are probably the hearers and companions of the psalm singer, who now step into the foreground. The wondrous change in life is commemorated in a graphic picture. He who was cast into the realm of death was like a stone which the builders threw away as unfit. Yet this stone has achieved honor. A despised stone has come to a prominent and important position. Verse 22 is very likely a proverb that emphatically bears witness to the wondrous change wrought by Yahweh. Whether or not verse 22 was itself a proverb, it could apply to any number of persons who felt rejected but then rose above their circumstances to a place of prominence. In such a context, then, the stone could be identified as Israel itself, or perhaps it was in reference to Israel's king, as Bratcher and Rayburn note in their own commentary. He had been near defeat and death, but now Yahweh has granted him victory and success. In later times, Judaism applied this verse not only to the king, but also to the expected Messiah, an interpretation adopted by the Christian Church. Verse 22 is applied to Jesus in Luke 20:17, Acts 4:11, 1 Peter 2:7, and it is perhaps alluded to in Ephesians 2:20, and verses 22 through 23 are noted in Matthew 21:42 and Mark 12:10 and 11. When used in New Testament literature, the identification of the stone is with Jesus as the rejected Messiah, but that is merely a Christological interpretation. Such an interpretation isn't necessarily true in the manner in which the Apologist wishes it to be. There is certainly nothing about the statement that the stone which was rejected by the builders is now the cornerstone is a prophetic utterance regarding a future Messiah. But even in the hands of the evangelists, the phrase is not used so much as a prophecy as it is an idiom. Its use in Acts chapter 4 may be the most explicit example of such use, but clearly associating Jesus with the rejected stone of Psalm 118 as the fulfillment of prophecy is not the passage's intent. In this section of Acts, the Apostle Peter is addressing the Jewish leaders who were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead, and for the healing of a man who was lame. Peter says in his defense, "Rulers and elders of the people, we are being called to account today for an act of kindness shown to a man who was lame, and are being asked how he was healed. Then know this, you and all the people of Israel. It is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead, that this man stands before you healed. Jesus is the stone you builders rejected, which has become the cornerstone. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved." Obviously, the author of Acts is not having Peter make the claim that Jesus is the fulfillment of a prophecy from the Hebrew Scriptures. But notice also how Peter ever so subtly rewords the verse, claiming the stone you builders rejected, instead of quoting directly from the psalm itself, which merely reads, "the stone the builders rejected." Peter was not speaking of the Jewish people generally, but specifically about the Jewish leaders, and so deliberately altered the reading of the psalm to fit his purposes. In fact, the reason the leaders had arrested Peter and convened their assembly was precisely because a number of the people had indeed been persuaded by the gospel message, and not an insignificant number at that. Ironically, and contrary to the assertion that the Jews are rejecting Jesus, the reason given in Acts 4 for the Jewish leaders' frustration with Peter was due to the report that the number of men who believed grew to about 5,000. In Matthew 21, where the Gospel's author has Jesus refer to the psalm, it isn't in reference to his fulfillment of the verse's prophecy, but is used at the conclusion of the parable of the tenants as a reference to the kingdom of God, not to himself. It is the kingdom of God that is being rejected, not Jesus as the Messiah. So, while there was a well-established practice of considering the Psalms as prophetic and interpreting them as such by various Jewish sects, including Christianity by the 1st century CE, this apparently wasn't the case for the New Testament authors in regard to Psalm 118. But even if it were being used as such, or if we merely accept that the New Testament authors associated the rejected stone of the psalm with Jesus, that does not mean the psalm itself really was prophetic, or that it in any way was written to point to Jesus as being rejected by his fellow Jews as the Messiah. In the original context of the psalm, no such prophetic intent can be found. Funding for this program was provided in part by Cody Seaton and from the generous contributions of other viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.